when my daughter-in-law, Kylie, screamed, "You are no longer welcome here! Get out!" I stood silently at the door of that massive Beverly Hills mansion. I smiled. I got into my car and made a single phone call. At that moment, she had no idea that the memory loss I suffered from hitting my head 2 months ago was actually my greatest weapon. She was oblivious to how everything she trusted, her husband and her rich father, was about to be annihilated by my little secret. My name is Marilyn. I am 68 years old, a retired teacher. I spent my years in a modest Los Angeles neighborhood, teaching children their ABCs. After I lost my husband, I was faced with the harsh reality that my pension wasn't enough to live on alone. When my son, Justin, said, "Mom, come live with us," it wasn't an invitation, it was a necessity. That place he called with us was my daughter-in-law, Kylie's palace in Beverly Hills. Kylie was a spoiled woman, floating on the wealth of her father, Donald. To her, I was just an old piece of furniture cluttering the expensive decor of her luxury mansion. And my son, Justin? Ah, my son. He had shrunk so much in his wife's shadow that he lacked the courage to defend his own mother against his father-in-law's wealth. In that house, I was the invisible ghost, until I made a mistake. That day was Halloween. Normally, I would decorate the house for my grandchildren, Leo and Mia, buy their favorite candy, and wait for them by the door. But this time, I didn't. 2 months prior, I'd had an unfortunate accident in the pantry. I fell and hit my head badly. The doctor had said, "You might experience temporary memory loss. You might confuse some moments." And that day, I had confused that moment entirely. Evening came. The doorbell rang. My little grandchildren stood there in their adorable costumes. "Grandma, trick or treat," they chirped. I froze. My hands were empty. There wasn't a single decoration in the house, not one piece of candy. Kylie hissed like a venomous snake from the top of the stairs. Her voice echoed down the expensive marble hallway. "I can't believe you. You did this even to your own grandchildren." I stammered. "Kylie, I swear. I forgot. My head." "Shut up," she yelled. "I'm sick of your excuses. You've ruined my son's life enough, and now you're ruining my children's special day?" "My father was right. You are just a burden to this family." Her eyes were ice cold. I knew she had been waiting for this moment, this perfect excuse to throw me out. I looked at my son, Justin. He avoided my gaze, inspecting the toes of his expensive Italian shoes, as usual. Kylie pointed her finger at the door. "Pack your bag. You are no longer welcome here. Get out." And that's when it happened. Those words, "get out," unlocked a rusty lock in my brain. That day, I hit my head. In the pantry. I hadn't just fallen. Right before I fell, I had seen something. In that small safe Kylie kept hidden, even from her own husband. Right then, standing in front of that enormous door, with only my old coat on, I smiled because I remembered everything now, and that memory was worth more than all the diamonds glittering on Kylie's wrists combined. I walked to my small room on the ground floor, the one tucked away near the laundry area where the help used to stay before Kylie fired them all for being too expensive. And I packed my few belongings into a worn suitcase that had traveled with me through decades of life. Leo and Mia came running to my door, with tears streaming down their little faces, and Leo grabbed my hand, saying, "Grandma, please don't go. We love you." And Mia buried her face in my cardigan, sobbing, but Kylie appeared like a dark shadow, yanking them away from me, hissing, "Don't you dare manipulate my children with your pathetic tears." I kissed both their foreheads and whispered, "I love you both more than all the stars in the sky, and I'll see you very soon, I promise." And the look of confusion in their innocent eyes almost broke my resolve. But I had to stay strong, because what I was about to do would secure their future, in ways they couldn't understand yet. I dragged my suitcase across that polished marble floor, and each wheel squeak echoed through the cavernous entryway like a countdown to something Kylie couldn't foresee. Justin stood there looking miserable and weak, and for a moment I thought he might finally stand up for me. But he just mumbled, "Mom, maybe you can stay at a hotel for a few days until things cool down, and I'll send you some money." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw what he had become, a shell of the strong boy I raised. The one who used to defend kids from bullies at school. The one who dreamed of being an architect but gave it all up to marry into money. Now he was just Donald's puppet and Kylie's doormat, and it made my heart ache, but I couldn't save him if he didn't want to be saved. I said nothing to him, just nodded and walked out into the cool October night, where jack-o'-lanterns grinned from neighboring porches and children's laughter filled the air while my own grandchildren were inside crying. I sat in my old Honda Civic, the one Justin kept telling me to get rid of because it embarrassed Kylie when it was parked in their circular driveway, and I pulled out my phone. The screen lit up my face in the darkness, and I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. Margaret Chen, my former student from 30 years ago, who had gone on to become one of the most respected attorneys in California. I pressed call. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and surprised. "Mrs. Rodriguez?" "Oh my goodness, I was just thinking about you the other day. How are you?" And I said, "Margaret, sweetheart, I need your help with something important, something that needs to be handled very carefully and very quietly." There was a pause, and then her tone shifted to professional concern. "What's wrong, Mrs. Rodriguez? Talk to me." I took a deep breath and began to explain. 2 months ago, I had an accident in Kylie's pantry. I fell and hit my head on a shelf, but right before I fell, I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. Kylie had opened a small safe hidden behind the canned goods. She didn't know I was there because I'd come in quietly to get some tea. And in that safe, I saw documents, stacks of them, and before I lost consciousness, I saw enough to understand what they were. Margaret asked what kind of documents, and I told her mortgage documents, loan papers, all in Justin's name. But with forged signatures, Kylie had been taking out loans against properties that Justin's company owned, properties that were actually owned by investors. She was running a scheme using her husband's credentials and her father Donald's connections to secure loans she never intended to pay back. The line went silent for a moment, and Margaret's voice came back sharp and focused. "That's mortgage fraud, Mrs. Rodriguez. That's serious federal crime territory. Are you absolutely certain about what you saw?" I told her I was certain, because after I woke up in the hospital, I started paying attention. I started listening to Kylie's phone calls when she thought I was napping. I watched her sneak out to meet with shady-looking men in expensive suits. I even found copies of bank statements she'd carelessly left in the recycling bin, showing transfers of hundreds of thousands of dollars to offshore accounts. "But here's the thing, Margaret," I said. "I have proof now, because 3 days ago, when everyone was out, I went back to that pantry safe. Kylie never changed the combination because she never knew I'd seen it. And I photographed everything with my phone, every single document, every bank statement, every forged signature." Margaret let out a low whistle and said, "Mrs. Rodriguez, you're sitting on a goldmine of evidence. This could bring down not just Kylie, but potentially her father too, if he's involved, which I'm guessing he is." I smiled in the darkness of my car and said that's exactly what I'm counting on, Margaret, because Donald has spent years making my son feel worthless and treating me like I'm invisible garbage and controlling everything in Justin's life through money and intimidation, and it's time someone held them accountable. Margaret's voice grew excited in that way it used to when she was my student solving a difficult problem, and she said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do. And first, you're going to come stay at my guest house, and I have a beautiful little cottage behind my main house in Pasadena. And you'll be safe there. And second, you're going to send me all those photos through encrypted email. And third, we're going to contact the FBI because this isn't just civil fraud. This is criminal, and they'll want to investigate." "But Margaret," I said carefully, and I need you to promise me something, and we don't move until I give you the signal, because I need to make sure Justin isn't going to go down with them, and he's weak, and he's been manipulated, but he's still my son, and I need to know he had no knowledge of what Kylie was doing. Margaret understood immediately, because she'd always been brilliant, and she said, "We'll investigate quietly, and we'll make sure Justin's involvement or lack thereof is crystal clear before any charges are filed, and if he's innocent, we'll make sure everyone knows it." And Mrs. Rodriguez, "I have to say, I'm proud of you for standing up to these people." I thanked her and drove to her address in Pasadena, and the cottage was perfect and small and cozy with a little garden, and it felt like a sanctuary after months of walking on eggshells in that cold Beverly Hills mansion. That night, I couldn't sleep because my mind kept replaying everything, and Kylie's face when she screamed at me, and my grandchildren's tears, and Justin's weakness, and Donald's smug superiority, and I knew what I was about to do would explode their entire world, but it had to be done. The next morning, I sent Margaret all the photos through the encrypted email she'd set up, and she called me 2 hours later saying, "Mrs. Rodriguez, this is even bigger than I thought, and these documents show a pattern of fraud going back at least 3 years, and the amounts we're talking about are in the millions, and this is definitely FBI territory." I asked her what happens next, and she said she was contacting a friend at the FBI White-Collar Crimes Division and someone named Agent Morrison who specialized in financial fraud and real estate schemes, and they'd want to interview me within the next few days. 3 days passed, and I heard nothing from Justin or Kylie, and not even a text message asking if I was okay or where I was staying, and that hurt more than I wanted to admit, because despite everything, he was still my son, and some part of me had hoped he'd come to his senses. On the 4th day, Agent Morrison came to Margaret's cottage, and he was a serious man in his 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes, and he listened to my entire story without interrupting once, and when I showed him the photographs on my phone, his expression grew darker with each swipe. He said, "Mrs. Rodriguez, what you've uncovered here is part of a larger investigation we've been conducting into Donald Chen's business practices, and we've suspected for over a year that he was using shell companies and family members to commit loan fraud. But we couldn't prove it, and you've just handed us the missing piece." I felt my heart race because I hadn't expected Donald to already be under investigation, and I asked if Justin was part of their investigation too. And Agent Morrison looked at me with something like sympathy and said, "We don't believe your son had any knowledge of the fraud, and in fact, our surveillance suggests he's been kept in the dark intentionally, and Kylie and her father specifically excluded him from key meetings and transactions." Relief washed over me like cool water, and I asked what would happen next, and Agent Morrison explained they'd need a few weeks to build the case and verify everything and cross-reference my evidence with what they already had, and then they'd execute search warrants and make arrests. "But here's what I need from you, Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, "and I need you to stay completely silent about this, and don't contact your son, and don't try to warn him, and don't give Kylie or Donald any indication that you know what they've done, because if they get spooked, they'll destroy evidence and flee, and we'll lose our chance." I promised I would stay silent, even though every fiber of my being wanted to call Justin and warn him that his wife was a criminal, and his father-in-law was about to be arrested, and his whole life was about to implode. 2 weeks crawled by like years, and I spent my days in Margaret's cottage reading books and tending to the small garden and trying not to think about Leo and Mia, and whether they missed me or whether Kylie had poisoned them against me completely. Margaret would visit every evening with updates, and she'd become my lifeline and my confidant. And one evening, she brought wine and Chinese takeout, and we sat in the little cottage like old friends, and she told me about her own life and her successful law practice and her struggles with her teenage daughter, and it felt good to connect with someone who saw me as a person and not just a burden. On day 16, Agent Morrison called and said the warrants were ready, and they'd be executing them tomorrow morning at 6 a.m., and I should prepare myself because this was going to be major news, and the media would be all over it given Donald's prominence in the Los Angeles business community. I didn't sleep that night, and I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about how everything was about to change, and how Kylie's world of luxury and superiority was about to come crashing down like a house of cards. At exactly 6:15 the next morning, my phone rang, and it was Justin, and his voice was panicked and shaking, and he said, "Mom, where are you? And the FBI is here, and they're tearing apart the house, and they've arrested Kylie, and they're looking for documents, and they say Dad Donald is being arrested at his office right now, and Mom, I don't understand what's happening." I took a deep breath and said, "Justin, honey, I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I'm safe, and I'm staying with a friend, and I need you to cooperate fully with the FBI and tell them everything you know, and don't try to protect Kylie because she doesn't deserve it." He was crying now, and his voice cracked as he said, "Mom, did you know about this? And is this why Kylie kicked you out and I don't understand anything? And they're saying, Kylie committed fraud and used my name and forged my signature. And Mom, I swear I didn't know anything about this." "I know you didn't, sweetheart," I said gently. "And that's why you're not being arrested. And that's why I made sure the FBI knew you were innocent before I gave them the evidence. And Justin, your wife has been stealing from people for years and using your name to do it, and your father-in-law was helping her, and they were going to let you take the fall when it all came crashing down." There was silence on the other end, and then Justin said in a small voice, "You gave them the evidence, and you did this, and his tone wasn't accusatory, just shocked, and I said, "Yes, baby, I did, because someone had to stop them and someone had to protect you, even if you weren't strong enough to protect yourself." He started sobbing and said, "Mom, I'm so sorry, and I'm sorry for letting her treat you that way, and I'm sorry for being weak, and I'm sorry for not standing up for you, and I've been a terrible son, and I don't deserve your help." My heart broke, hearing him finally admit what I'd known for years, and I said, "Justin, you're not a terrible son. You're a good man who got lost and got manipulated by people who knew how to exploit your kindness, and we're going to get through this together, and you're going to rebuild your life without them controlling you." He asked where I was staying, and I told him Margaret's address, and he said he'd come see me as soon as the FBI finished questioning him, and he needed to see his mom, and he needed to say so many things to me, face to face. I hung up and cried for the first time since this whole nightmare began, and they were tears of relief and sadness and hope all mixed together. By noon, the news had exploded across every channel, and Donald Chen, prominent real estate developer, arrested for massive fraud scheme, and his daughter Kylie Chen also arrested, and federal investigators say the fraud totals over $8 million and involves dozens of victims and falsified loan applications. Margaret came rushing over with her laptop, and we watched the news together, and there was footage of Kylie being led out of the mansion in handcuffs, and her face was a mask of rage and disbelief, and there was Donald being perp-walked out of his downtown office building looking old and defeated. The reporter said authorities credit an anonymous tipster with providing crucial evidence that broke the case wide open, and Margaret looked at me with pride and said, "You did this, Mrs. Rodriguez, and you brought down an entire criminal enterprise." I didn't feel victorious, though, and I felt tired and sad, because yes, they deserved what they got, but it still meant my son's marriage was over, and my grandchildren would grow up knowing their mother was a criminal, and their grandfather was in prison. Justin arrived at the cottage 3 hours later, and his eyes were red and swollen, and he looked like he'd aged 10 years in a single day. And when he saw me standing in the doorway, he collapsed into my arms like a little boy and sobbed into my shoulder. We went inside and sat on the small couch, and I made him tea the way I used to when he was young and had a bad day at school, and for a long time we just sat there in silence while he tried to compose himself. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was hollow, and he said, "The FBI agent told me everything, and he told me about the forged signatures and the fake loan applications and the offshore accounts. And Mom, she was going to let me go to prison, and she and Donald had a plan that if everything fell apart, they'd make it look like I was the mastermind, and they were innocent." I held his hand and said, I know, sweetheart, and that's why I had to act, and that's why I couldn't tell you, because if you'd known, you might have tried to warn her or confront her, and you'd have ruined the investigation." He looked at me with something like awe and said, "How did you figure it all out, and how did you even know what you were looking at in that safe, and you were just a teacher? How did you understand mortgage fraud and financial crimes?" I smiled and said, "Justin, I may have taught elementary school, but I spent 40 years watching people and reading them and understanding their motivations. And after I saw those documents, I spent weeks researching online and reading everything I could about real estate fraud. And I even took an online course about financial crimes. And honey, never underestimate what a determined grandmother can do when her family is in danger." He laughed through his tears and said, "You're incredible, Mom, and I don't deserve you. And I was so horrible to you, and I let her kick you out on Halloween, and I'll never forgive myself for that." I told him we had time to heal and time to rebuild, but first, he needed to focus on protecting himself legally and protecting Leo and Mia, and making sure they understood that none of this was their fault. He nodded and said the FBI told him he wasn't a target of the investigation, and they'd made it clear publicly that he was a victim of his wife's schemes and not a co-conspirator, and his lawyer said he should file for divorce immediately and seek full custody of the children. Over the next few days, the details emerged, and Kylie and Donald had created a network of fake companies and used Justin's identity and his legitimate business licenses to secure loans they never intended to repay, and they'd pocketed millions while Justin worked long hours thinking he was building a legitimate real estate development company. The victims were everywhere, and elderly couples who'd been scammed out of their retirement savings, and small banks that had approved loans based on falsified documents, and investors who'd put money into projects that never existed, and the scope of the damage was staggering. Margaret told me that Kylie and Donald were both looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison, and there was no way they'd get bail because they had access to offshore accounts and were considered flight risks, and the prosecutor was pushing for maximum sentences. Justin moved out of the Beverly Hills mansion and into a modest apartment in Burbank, and he said he never wanted to live in that house again because every room reminded him of his failures and his blindness, and how he'd let wealth and status corrupt his judgment. He brought Leo and Mia to visit me at the cottage, and when they saw me, Leo ran into my arms screaming, "Grandma, we missed you so much," and Mia clung to my legs and wouldn't let go. And Justin stood there watching us with tears streaming down his face. I spent that whole afternoon with my grandchildren, and we made cookies in Margaret's kitchen, and I read them stories, and we didn't talk about their mother or what had happened, and we just existed in that bubble of love and normalcy that children desperately need when their world is falling apart. As weeks turned into months, the legal proceedings ground forward, and Kylie tried every trick her expensive lawyers could think of, and she claimed she was innocent and that Donald had manipulated her, and she even tried to claim that Justin had known all along and was lying to save himself, but the evidence was overwhelming, and her stories kept changing and contradicting themselves. Donald, on the other hand, went silent, and his lawyers advised him to take a plea deal, and he eventually agreed to testify against Kylie in exchange for a reduced sentence, and even in the end, he was trying to save himself at his daughter's expense. Justin filed for divorce, and the proceedings were fast-tracked given the circumstances, and Kylie tried to claim she deserved half of everything. But the judge ruled that since most of the assets were obtained through fraud, she had no legal claim to them, and Justin was awarded full custody of Leo and Mia, with Kylie getting supervised visitation rights once she was released from prison. The trial was a media circus, and reporters camped outside the courthouse, and every day brought new revelations about the depth of the fraud, and I was called to testify, and I walked into that courtroom in my simple dress and sensible shoes, and I told the truth about everything I'd seen and discovered. Kylie stared at me from the defense table with pure hatred in her eyes, and her lawyer tried to paint me as a vindictive mother-in-law who'd fabricated evidence, but Margaret, who was sitting in the gallery, gave me an encouraging nod, and I stayed calm and answered every question honestly and clearly. The prosecutor asked me why I'd risked everything to expose the fraud, and I looked directly at the jury and said, because my grandchildren deserve to grow up knowing that truth and justice matter, and because my son deserved to be free from manipulation, and because the victims of this fraud deserve to have someone fight for them, and I may be just an old retired teacher, but I know right from wrong. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, and they came back with guilty verdicts on all counts, and Kylie's face went white and she started screaming at the judge about how this was a setup and how I'd poisoned everyone against her, and the bailiffs had to restrain her as she was led out of the courtroom. Donald's sentencing came first, and he got 12 years in federal prison, and he stood before the judge looking broken and defeated, and the judge said, "Donald Chen, you used your position and your wealth to prey on innocent people, and you showed no remorse, and you attempted to sacrifice your own daughter to save yourself, and you deserve every day of this sentence." Kylie's sentencing was 2 weeks later, and the prosecutor argued for the maximum and detailed every victim whose life she'd ruined, and every forged signature, and every lie. And the judge looked at Kylie with disgust and said, 18 years in federal prison, and you will make restitution to every single victim, even if it takes the rest of your life. Kylie screamed and lunged toward the prosecutor's table, but the bailiffs caught her, and as they dragged her out, she turned and looked directly at me and screamed, "This is all your fault, and you destroyed my family, and I hope you're happy, you bitter old woman." I sat perfectly still and said nothing because I didn't need to respond, and justice had spoken, and that was enough. Justin and I walked out of the courthouse together, and reporters swarmed us shouting questions, and Justin put his arm around me protectively and said, "My mother is a hero, and she saved me and my children from criminals, and we have no further comment," and we pushed through the crowd to Margaret's car, where she was waiting to drive us away. That night, the three of us sat in Margaret's living room, and she opened a bottle of champagne, and we toasted to justice and new beginnings, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, and I felt powerful and capable and like I mattered. Justin looked at me and said, "Mom, I've been thinking, and I want you to move in with me and Leo and Mia, and I know the apartment is small, but we'll make it work, and I want my kids to grow up knowing their grandmother and learning from her strength, and I never want to take you for granted again." I smiled and said I'd love that, but I also wanted to keep the cottage as a backup because Margaret had insisted I could stay as long as I needed, and having my own space had been healing in ways I hadn't expected. We worked out an arrangement where I'd spend weekdays with Justin and the kids and weekends at the cottage, and it gave me the perfect balance of family time and solitude, and for the first time in years I felt like I had control over my own life. The media attention was intense for a few weeks, and reporters wanted interviews and TV shows, wanted me to appear and tell my story, and at first I refused everything because I didn't do this for fame or attention, but Margaret convinced me that sharing my story might help other people in similar situations and might give hope to people who felt powerless against wealthy manipulators. So, I agreed to one interview with a local news station, and the interviewer was a kind woman named Sandra, who asked thoughtful questions and didn't try to sensationalize anything, and when the interview aired, it went viral, and suddenly, I was getting emails and messages from people all over the country. Elderly people who'd been taken advantage of by family members and spouses, who'd discovered fraud and were afraid to come forward, and adult children who'd watched their parents be abused and hadn't known how to help, and they all said my story gave them courage. One email particularly touched me, and it was from a woman named Patricia in Arizona, and she wrote, "Mrs. Rodriguez, I'm 71 years old, and my son-in-law has been stealing from me for 3 years, and I discovered it 6 months ago, but I was too afraid to report it because I didn't want to hurt my daughter. And after seeing your interview, I contacted the police. And thank you for showing me that protecting family sometimes means holding them accountable." I cried reading that email, and I responded personally, and I connected Patricia with Margaret, who helped her find a good lawyer in Arizona. And 6 months later, Patricia wrote to tell me her son-in-law had been arrested, and her daughter had divorced him, and they were rebuilding their relationship, and she credited me with saving her life. Stories like Patricia's kept coming, and Margaret suggested we start an organization to help elderly victims of family fraud and financial abuse. And at first, I thought I was too old and too tired. But then I realized this was my purpose, and this was why I'd gone through everything I'd gone through. We called it the Silver Shield Foundation, and Margaret handled all the legal work pro bono, and I became the face of the organization. And we created a hotline and a website with resources, and we connected victims with lawyers and investigators and support groups. Within a year, we'd helped over 200 families and saved countless people from financial ruin, and the organization grew beyond anything I'd imagined, and major donors started contributing, and law firms offered free legal services, and it became a real movement. Justin watched all of this with pride and amazement, and one evening, while we were having dinner at his apartment, he said, "Mom, do you realize you've become like a superhero to all these people, and you've turned your pain into something beautiful?" I laughed and said, "I'm no superhero, sweetheart, and I'm just a retired teacher who got mad and refused to be silent, and sometimes that's all it takes to change things." Leo and Mia adjusted surprisingly well considering everything they'd been through, and we were honest with them in age-appropriate ways, and we explained that their mother had made bad choices and broken the law, and would be away for a long time, and they cried and asked questions, and we answered everything truthfully. What helped most was stability and routine, and Justin made sure they stayed in the same school and kept the same friends, and every night we had dinner together, and every weekend we did something fun, and slowly they started smiling again and laughing again and being kids again. Mia, who was 8, started having nightmares about people taking her away, and I'd sit with her in the middle of the night and stroke her hair and tell her she was safe and loved, and that Grandma would never let anything bad happen to her, and eventually the nightmares faded. Leo, who was 10, became very protective of his father and me, and he'd ask questions about the trial and the fraud, and he wanted to understand everything, and Justin and I decided to be honest with him, and we explained how people sometimes do wrong things for money, and how important it was to have integrity even when no one is watching. One day, Leo came home from school and said he'd written an essay about heroes and his teacher had read it to the class, and he handed me a copy, and the essay was about me and how I'd stood up to bad people even though I was scared, and how I'd taught him that being brave doesn't mean not being afraid, and it means doing the right thing even when it's hard. I cried reading that essay, and I hugged Leo tight and told him I was proud of him and that he was going to grow up to be an amazing man, and he said, "I want to be like you, Grandma, and I want to help people who can't help themselves." The restitution process began, and the federal government seized all of Kylie and Donald's assets, and that included the Beverly Hills mansion and Donald's office building and luxury cars and jewelry and artwork, and everything was auctioned off to pay back the victims. Justin was allowed to keep his legitimate business because the FBI determined it was separate from the fraudulent activities, and although it had been damaged by the scandal, he worked hard to rebuild trust and reputation, and slowly clients started coming back. One afternoon, Margaret called and said, "Mrs. Rodriguez, you need to come to my office right away, and there's something you need to see," and I drove over immediately, worried that something had gone wrong with the case. But when I walked into her office, she was smiling, and she handed me a check and said, "This is your portion of the whistleblower reward, and the federal government offers rewards to people who report fraud, and your information led to the recovery of $8 million, and this is your percentage." I looked at the check and couldn't believe the number, and it was for $400,000, and I said, "Margaret, this can't be right, and this is too much." And she laughed and said, "It's absolutely right, and you earned every penny, and you should use it to secure your future and maybe expand the Silver Shield Foundation." I sat down in shock, and for 40 years I'd lived on a teacher's pension and worried about money, and now suddenly I had more money than I'd ever dreamed of, and I didn't know what to do with it. Margaret helped me set up accounts and invest wisely, and we put a significant portion into the foundation, and I bought a small house near Justin's apartment so I could be close to my grandchildren and still have my independence, and I even bought a new car to replace my old Honda. Justin was happy for me, but also a little sad, and he said, "Mom, you shouldn't have had to go through all of this to finally have financial security, and I'm sorry I didn't take better care of you." And I said, "Sweetheart, everything happens for a reason, and I wouldn't change anything, because look at all the good that's come from it. The first anniversary of Kylie's arrest arrived, and we didn't celebrate, but we acknowledged it quietly, and Justin took me and the kids to the beach, and we spent the day building sand castles and flying kites and being a family. Leo said, "Grandma, are you glad Mom did what she did? Because if she hadn't, then you wouldn't have found the bad stuff, and Daddy wouldn't have gotten away from her?" And I thought carefully about how to answer. I said, "Leo, I'm not glad your mother broke the law, and I'm not glad she hurt people. But I am glad that the truth came out, and I'm glad your daddy is free, and I'm glad we're all together, and sometimes painful things lead to better things." He seemed satisfied with that answer and ran off to chase seagulls with Mia and Justin, and I sat on the sand watching them. Justin said, "Mom, I've been seeing a therapist, and she's helping me understand how I got so lost and how I let Kylie and Donald control me, and I'm learning about codependency and manipulation tactics, and it's hard, but it's necessary." I told him I was proud of him for doing that work, and that healing takes courage, and he squeezed my hand and said, "I learned that from you, and you could have just walked away and started over somewhere else, but instead, you fought for me and for truth, and Mom, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that." The second year brought more changes, and the Silver Shield Foundation received a major grant from a national organization dedicated to elder abuse prevention, and we were able to hire staff and open a physical office and create educational programs for seniors about financial fraud warning signs. I became a sought-after speaker and traveled to conferences and community centers, and I'd stand in front of audiences and tell my story and teach people how to protect themselves, and every time someone would come up afterward and say, "Thank you, and you've given me hope," and I knew I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Kylie's mother reached out to me through a lawyer and requested a meeting, and at first I refused, because what could we possibly have to say to each other? But Margaret convinced me to at least hear her out. We met at a neutral location and a coffee shop in Santa Monica, and Kylie's mother, whose name was Patricia, looked older and broken, and she started crying the moment she saw me and said, "I'm so sorry for everything, and I knew Donald was ruthless, but I didn't know about the fraud, and I didn't know Kylie had become like him." I listened without saying much, and she talked about how Donald had always been obsessed with wealth and status, and how he'd raised Kylie to believe that money was the only thing that mattered, and how she'd tried to instill better values, but had been overruled at every turn. She said, "I lost my daughter long before she went to prison, and I lost her to greed and ego. And I'm sorry she treated you so horribly, and I'm sorry for what she did to Justin and to those poor people she defrauded, and I just wanted you to know that not everyone in our family is like them." I softened a bit and said, "I appreciate you telling me this," and I asked her if she'd been in contact with Kylie, and she shook her head and said, "Kylie won't speak to me, and she blames me for not standing up to Donald more, and for not teaching her better, and maybe she's right." I told her that Kylie was an adult who made her own choices, and that she couldn't take responsibility for her daughter's crimes, and Patricia asked if she could see Leo and Mia sometime, and said they were still her grandchildren, and she missed them terribly. I said I'd have to ask Justin, and that it was his decision, but I'd put in a good word for her, and she thanked me with tears streaming down her face, and we parted ways, and I felt a strange mixture of pity and relief. Justin was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed to let Patricia see the kids under supervision, and it turned out to be good for everyone, and Patricia was kind and humble, and the kids needed to know they had family on both sides who loved them. The third year brought the most unexpected development, and I received a letter forwarded through Margaret's office, and it was from Kylie, and I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was 6 pages long and handwritten, and Kylie's tone was completely different from the venomous woman I'd known, and she wrote Mrs. Rodriguez, "I've had 3 years to think about everything and 3 years to face what I did, and I'm writing this not because I expect forgiveness, but because I need you to know that I understand now." She went on to say that prison had stripped away all her illusions and all her entitlement, and she'd been forced to confront the person she'd become, and she'd hurt so many people and destroyed so many lives, including her own children's, and she took full responsibility. She wrote about missing Leo and Mia every single day, and about how she'd thrown away the most important things in life chasing money and status. And she said, if I could go back, I'd trade everything for one more Halloween with my kids and one more chance to treat you with the respect you deserved. The letter ended with, I know I'm going to be here for many more years, and I know my children will grow up without me, and I know I deserve that. But I hope that someday, and maybe when they're adults, and they'll let me try to explain and try to apologize. And Mrs. Rodriguez, thank you for saving them from me. And thank you for being the grandmother they needed when I failed them as a mother. I sat with that letter for days and showed it to Justin and Margaret and asked them what they thought. And Justin said, it sounds sincere, but Mom, she's manipulated people her whole life. And how do we know this isn't just another con? Margaret said only time will tell if she's really changed, and prison either breaks people or transforms them. And we won't know which category Kylie falls into until she's released. I decided to write back, and I kept it brief, and I said, Kylie, I received your letter, and I appreciate your words, and time will tell if you mean them. And what I want you to know is that Leo and Mia are thriving, and they're happy and healthy, and they're growing into wonderful people. And they ask about you sometimes, and we tell them the truth, and we tell them you made mistakes. But that doesn't mean you don't love them. And maybe someday, when they're ready, they'll want to have a relationship with you. But that will be their choice, not ours. I never got a response, and maybe she had nothing more to say, or maybe my words hit too hard, and either way, I felt at peace with it. The foundation continued to grow, and we helped thousands of people. And the success stories kept coming, and we'd get letters saying, you saved my house, or you helped me get justice, or you gave me the courage to fight back. And each one reminded me why I'd started this journey. Justin's business fully recovered, and he was thriving, and he'd learned from his mistakes, and built a company based on integrity and transparency, and clients trusted him, and his reputation was stronger than ever. One evening, he sat me down and said, Mom, I've been thinking about something, and I want to create a scholarship fund in your name, and a fund for students who want to study law or criminal justice or social work, and students who want to help people like you, help people. I was touched and said, Justin, that's a beautiful idea, but you don't have to do that. And he said, yes, I do. And I need to do something meaningful with my success. And I need to honor what you've taught me about using our resources to help others. We created the Marilyn Rodriguez Scholarship Fund, and the first year we awarded 5 scholarships, and one of them went to a young woman named Carmen, whose grandmother had been defrauded by a caretaker, and Carmen wanted to become an elder law attorney. And when she met me at the award ceremony, she hugged me tight and said, you're my hero, and I'm going to spend my career fighting for people like you, and your foundation helped. Leo turned 13 and was becoming a thoughtful young man, and he joined the debate team at school and volunteered at a senior center on weekends. And he told me once that he'd decided to become either a lawyer or a FBI agent so he could fight fraud like I did. Mia turned 11 and was artistic and sensitive, and she'd started writing stories and drawing pictures, and her favorite subject was strong women who overcame adversity. And she'd written a story about a grandmother who saved her family from a dragon, and I didn't need to ask who the grandmother was based on. The 4th anniversary of the arrest came and went, and we had a small family dinner and reflected on how far we'd come, and Justin raised his glass and said to Mom, and to second chances, and to the power of truth, and we all clinked glasses, and even the kids understood the significance. Margaret had become like a daughter to me, and we had dinner together at least once a week, and she'd share stories about her cases, and I'd share stories about the foundation, and we'd laugh about the old days when she was my student, and I was teaching her multiplication tables. One day, she said, Mrs. Rodriguez, do you ever regret how everything went down, and do you ever wish you'd just walked away and lived your life quietly? And I thought about it and said, honestly, Margaret, not for a second. And yes, it was hard. And yes, it was painful. But look at what came from it, and I found my purpose, and I saved my son, and I helped thousands of people. And how could I regret that? The 5th year brought news that Donald had died in prison, and heart attack at age 73. And Patricia called to tell me, and she was crying, but also said she felt relieved, and she said, he can't hurt anyone anymore, and maybe now I can finally move on. Kylie had 5 years left on her sentence, and according to Patricia, she'd been a model prisoner and taken every educational program offered, and was working in the prison library and teaching other inmates to read, and whether it was genuine rehabilitation or just good behavior for early parole remained to be seen. Justin asked me one day if I'd ever consider meeting with Kylie face-to-face before she was released, and I said I honestly didn't know, and part of me felt I had nothing to say to her, and part of me was curious if she'd really changed, and I told him I'd think about it. The foundation celebrated its 5th anniversary with a gala fundraiser, and over 500 people attended, and we raised $2 million in one night, and I gave a speech about the journey, and about how one person's courage can ripple out and change hundreds of lives. During the speech, I saw faces in the audience, and victims we'd helped, and lawyers who volunteered, and donors who believed in the mission, and my son and grandchildren in the front row, and Margaret beaming with pride, and I felt overwhelming gratitude. I said into the microphone 5 years ago, I was kicked out of a mansion on Halloween, and 5 years ago, I was called a burden and made to feel worthless but that moment of pain became the catalyst for all of this, and so in a strange way, I'm grateful to Kylie for showing me what I was capable of, and I'm grateful for the fall that made me remember what I'd seen, and I'm grateful for every hard moment because it led to this. The audience stood and applauded, and people were crying, and afterward, dozens of people came up to hug me and thank me and tell me their stories, and I stayed until the very last person had been heard. Leo graduated middle school at the top of his class and gave a speech at graduation about integrity and courage, and he looked right at me when he said the most important lesson I've learned came from my grandmother, who taught me that doing the right thing is more important than being comfortable. And I wiped away tears, and Justin squeezed my hand. Mia's artwork was selected for a citywide exhibition, and her piece was a painting of a woman standing in front of a door with light streaming through. And when people asked her what it meant, she said, "It's about my grandma and how she walked through a scary door and found light on the other side." I turned 73, and we had a big party and invited everyone from the foundation and Justin's friends and Margaret's family, and even Patricia came and brought the kids beautiful gifts, and it felt like I'd built a whole new family from the ashes of the old one. During the party, Justin stood up and gave a toast and said, "Mom, 6 years ago, I was the weakest version of myself, and I was controlled and manipulated and blind to the truth, and you could have given up on me, and you could have walked away, but instead, you fought for me, and you showed me what real strength looks like, and everything I am today, and everything my kids are becoming is because of you, and I love you more than words can say." I was crying by the end, and everyone was crying, and I stood up and said, "Justin, you were never weak, and you were just lost. And everyone gets lost sometimes. And what matters is that you found your way back, and I'm so proud of the man you've become, and I'm so grateful to be your mother." Margaret announced that the Silver Shield Foundation had helped over 5,000 families and prevented over $50 million in elder fraud, and we'd become a model for other organizations across the country. And I could barely believe those numbers. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I sat in my little house and looked at the photos on my walls and pictures of Leo and Mia and Justin and my late husband and my former students and victims we'd helped, and I thought about the journey. 6 years ago, I'd been invisible and voiceless and dismissed, and now I had purpose and power and respect, and I'd learned that age is just a number and that experience is valuable, and that sometimes the people who seem the weakest are actually the strongest. I thought about Kylie still in prison with years left to serve, and I wondered if she'd really changed, or if she was just biding her time, and I realized I might never know, and I had to be okay with that, and my peace couldn't depend on her redemption, and it had to come from within myself. The next morning, I woke up to a call from Margaret saying, "Mrs. Rodriguez, you're not going to believe this, and the Department of Justice wants to give you a special recognition award, and they're honoring civilians who've made extraordinary contributions to fighting financial crimes, and the ceremony is in Washington, D.C. next month. I flew to Washington with Justin and the kids, and Margaret came too, and we toured the monuments and ate at fancy restaurants, and the kids were excited to see the nation's capital, and I felt like a tourist in the best way. The ceremony was held at the Department of Justice building, and there were maybe 20 people being honored, and each had their own story of courage and whistleblowing and fighting corruption, and I felt honored to be among them. When it was my turn to receive the award, the Assistant Attorney General read my citation, and it detailed how my evidence had led to the conviction of multiple criminals and the recovery of millions of dollars and the prevention of future frauds through the Foundation's work. I walked up to the podium and accepted the Crystal Award and shook hands with the officials, and cameras flashed, and then I was asked to say a few words, and I looked out at the audience and saw Justin and Leo and Mia and Margaret, and I smiled. I said, "I'm just a retired teacher from Los Angeles, and 6 years ago, I was kicked out of my family's home on Halloween, but that moment taught me something important, and it taught me that we all have power even when we feel powerless, and we all have the ability to fight back against injustice, even when the odds seem impossible. And if my story inspires even one person to stand up and speak truth to power, then every hard moment was worth it." The room erupted in applause, and afterward, people came up to take photos and ask questions, and news outlets wanted interviews. And I did them all because I wanted the message to spread far and wide, and I wanted people to know they didn't have to accept abuse or fraud or mistreatment just because the perpetrators were family or wealthy or powerful. We flew back to Los Angeles, and I felt lighter somehow, and I'd been carrying a weight I didn't even know was there, and receiving official recognition from the government validated everything I'd done and confirmed that I'd made the right choices. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from the prison, and it was from Kylie again, and this one was shorter, and she wrote, "Mrs. Rodriguez, I saw your award ceremony on the news, and they broadcast it in the common room, and I watched you accept that award and talk about fighting injustice, and all I could think was that I was the injustice you fought, and I was the villain in your hero story. And you know what? And I can't even be mad about it because it's true, and I earned that role. And I'm writing this to tell you that seeing you up there, and strong and honored, and surrounded by people who love you, made me realize something, and I threw away my chance to be part of something good, and I chose greed and status over family and love and integrity, and I can't undo that, but I can make sure I never make those choices again, and I'm not asking for forgiveness, and I'm not asking for anything, and I just wanted you to know that you won, and not just legally, but morally and spiritually, and you won at life and I lost, and I accept that." I read the letter twice and felt a strange mixture of sadness and vindication, and I showed it to Justin, and he said, "What do you think, Mom? And is she really getting it, or is she just feeling sorry for herself?" And I said, "Honestly, I think she's finally understanding what she lost, and whether she can actually change remains to be seen. But at least she's not denying reality anymore." I wrote back one more time, and I said, "Kylie, life isn't about winning and losing, and it's about learning and growing and making amends where possible, and you have years ahead of you to figure out who you want to be when you get out, and my advice is to focus on that, and focus on becoming someone your children can eventually respect, even if they never fully trust you again, and that's the best you can hope for at this point." That was the last letter I sent, and I heard through Patricia that Kylie had taped my response to her cell wall and read it every day, and again, I didn't know if that meant anything real, but at least she was trying. The foundation continued to thrive, and we opened satellite offices in 3 more states, and hired a full-time staff of 15 people, and created partnerships with law enforcement agencies and elder advocacy groups across the country. I cut back on my speaking engagements because I was getting tired more easily, and I was 73 after all, and I wanted to spend more time with Leo and Mia, and watch them grow, and be present for the everyday moments, and not just the big ones. Justin met someone new, and a kind woman named Rachel, who was a pediatric nurse, and she was gentle and honest, and the opposite of Kylie in every way, and I liked her immediately, and more importantly, Leo and Mia liked her too. They took things slowly, and Justin was cautious and gun-shy after everything he'd been through. But Rachel was patient and understanding, and after a year of dating, he brought her to family dinner and announced they were engaged, and we all celebrated. The wedding was small and intimate and held in Margaret's backyard, and Leo walked his dad down the aisle, and Mia was the flower girl, and I stood there watching my son marry a good woman and felt my heart could burst with happiness. Rachel told me at the reception, "Mrs. Rodriguez, thank you for raising such a good man, and thank you for teaching him what real strength and integrity look like, and I promise I'll spend my life honoring that." And I hugged her and said, "Welcome to the family, sweetheart, and call me Marilyn or Mom, and whatever feels right." Life settled into a comfortable rhythm, and I spent my mornings working on foundation business and my afternoons with the grandkids and my evenings reading or having dinner with friends, and I felt content in a way I'd never felt before. On Halloween, 7 years after the night Kylie kicked me out, I decorated Justin and Rachel's house and bought bags of candy and dressed up as a witch to make the kids laugh. And when Leo and Mia came running in after trick-or-treating, they dumped their candy on the floor and sorted it into piles, and I sat with them just like I'd always dreamed of doing. Mia looked up at me and said, "Grandma, do you remember when Mom kicked you out on Halloween?" And I said, "Yes, sweetheart, I remember." And she said, "I'm glad she did. And is that bad to say?" And I asked why she felt that way. And she said, "Because if she hadn't, then you wouldn't have stopped her, and Daddy wouldn't have met Rachel, and we wouldn't be this happy." I kissed her forehead and said, "You're very wise, Mia. And sometimes the worst moments lead to the best outcomes, and that's one of life's mysteries." And she smiled and went back to sorting candy. And I sat there thinking about how true her words were. That night, after the kids were in bed, Justin and Rachel and I sat on the porch and drank hot cider and looked at the stars, and Justin said, "Mom, I have something to tell you, and Rachel's pregnant, and we're having a baby, and you're going to be a grandmother again." I screamed with joy and hugged them both and cried happy tears, and I thought about how 7 years ago I'd been thrown out of a mansion, and now I was sitting on my son's porch celebrating new life and new beginnings, and how far we'd all come. The ending I'd dreamed of wasn't about revenge or seeing Kylie suffer, and it was about building something beautiful from the ashes and creating a family based on love and honesty, and watching my son become the man I always knew he could be, and using my pain to help others, and that was better than any revenge could ever be. As I sat there under the stars, surrounded by people who loved me and respected me and valued me, I realized I'd already won, and I won the moment I decided to stand up and fight back, and I won the moment I chose truth over comfort, and I won every single day that I woke up with purpose and used my voice to help others, and that was the greatest victory of all. The baby arrived 6 months later, and a beautiful little girl named Grace, and they asked if they could give her the middle name Marilyn, and I cried for an hour straight and held that tiny bundle and whispered promises about all the things I'd teach her and all the love I'd give her. Leo was now 16 and had been accepted into a prestigious summer program for aspiring lawyers, and he wrote his application essay about me and about learning that justice isn't just something you read about in books, and it's something you fight for even when it costs you everything. Mia was 14 and had started a blog about strong women in history, and her most popular post was titled, "My grandmother took down criminals and saved our family," and it had been shared thousands of times, and teachers were using it in their classes to talk about courage and integrity. The foundation had grown beyond anything I'd imagined, and we'd helped over 10,000 families and trained hundreds of volunteers and created educational materials that were being used in senior centers across all 50 states, and Margaret had taken over as executive director, so I could step back and focus on family. I still gave occasional speeches, but mostly I spent my days being grandma and picking up Leo from debate practice and attending Mia's art shows and babysitting little Grace, while Justin and Rachel went on date nights, and this was the life I'd always wanted. One afternoon, the doorbell rang, and a courier delivered a thick envelope, and inside were legal documents showing that Kylie had signed away all her parental rights, and there was a letter attached that said, "I've thought about this for 3 years, And I've realized the most loving thing I can do for Leo and Mia is let them go and let them build their lives without the shadow of my mistakes hanging over them. And Rachel has been more of a mother to them than I ever was. And she deserves to adopt them if she wants to, and if they want that, and this is my gift to them, and the only good thing I can do from in here. Justin called a family meeting and showed Leo and Mia the documents and asked them what they wanted, and Leo said without hesitation, "I want Rachel to adopt me, and she's been there for everything, and she loves us, and Mom Kylie made her choice, and now I'm making mine." Mia was quieter and more thoughtful, and she said, "I think part of me will always love the mom I thought I had, but that person doesn't exist, and Rachel is real, and she's here, and she chooses us every day, and yes, I want her to adopt me too." The adoption was finalized 3 months later, and we had a small celebration, and Rachel cried happy tears and promised to honor the responsibility, and Leo and Mia seemed lighter somehow, and like they'd been carrying a weight they could finally put down. Patricia continued to visit regularly, and she'd become like a sister to me in a strange way, and two women who'd both been hurt by the same people, and who'd both found ways to heal and move forward, and she told me once that watching me turn pain into purpose had inspired her to start volunteering at a women's shelter, and she was finally finding her own voice. I turned 75, and my birthday party was huge, and people came from all over the country, and former students and foundation volunteers and families we'd helped, and lawyers and FBI agents, and even Agent Morrison, who'd handled the original case, and he brought me flowers and said, "Mrs. Rodriguez, you started a revolution, and elder fraud prosecutions have tripled since your case, and you've saved countless lives." During the party, I looked around at the crowded room and saw Justin holding baby Grace and dancing with Rachel and Leo, deep in conversation with Margaret about law school, and Mia showing her artwork to a group of admiring adults, and I felt overwhelming gratitude. I thought about that Halloween night 8 years ago, when I'd stood at the door of that mansion with nothing but a suitcase and a head full of dangerous knowledge, and I'd been terrified and heartbroken and lost. And if someone had told me then what my life would become, I never would have believed them. The foundation announced they were renaming the organization in my honor, and it would now be called the Marilyn Rodriguez Silver Shield Foundation, and they commissioned a plaque for the office that read, "One woman's courage changed thousands of lives," and I objected, saying it wasn't just me, and it was Margaret and Agent Morrison and all the volunteers, but they insisted, and the plaque went up anyway. News came that Kylie would be eligible for early release in 2 years instead of 5 due to good behavior and educational achievements, and she'd earned her college degree in prison and was working toward a master's in social work. And whether she'd actually changed or was just playing the system remained to be seen, and honestly, I'd made peace with never knowing for certain. Justin asked me if I'd be okay with Kylie reaching out to the kids after her release, and I said that decision has to be theirs, and they're old enough now to decide if they want contact, and I'll support whatever they choose. And I meant it because I'd learned that you can't control other people's journeys, and you can only walk your own path with integrity. Leo announced he'd been accepted to Stanford with a full scholarship, and he wanted to study law and policy and eventually work for the Department of Justice, and when he told me his eyes were shining, and he said, "Grandma, I want to do what you did, and I want to fight for people who can't fight for themselves," and I hugged him tight and said, "You already are, sweetheart, and you already are." Mia sold her first piece of art to a gallery and a painting of a woman walking through a doorway into light, and the gallery owner said it spoke to themes of transformation and courage, and she had no idea it was about me. And when Mia told her the story, the owner wanted to feature the whole series and do an exhibition called Portraits of Resilience. I attended the exhibition opening and saw myself through Mia's eyes, and painting after painting, showing different moments, and me discovering the documents, and me testifying in court, and me accepting the award in Washington, and me holding baby Grace, and each one showed strength and determination and love, and I barely recognized myself as that powerful woman. But Mia insisted that's who I'd always been. Rachel came to me one evening and said, "Marilyn, I need to tell you something, and I'm pregnant again, and we're having twins, and I know that's a lot. But I wanted you to be the first to know after Justin. And I laughed and cried and said, Rachel, that's wonderful. And this family just keeps growing. And she said it's because you created a foundation of love and safety, and everyone wants to be part of that. The foundation won a national award, and Margaret accepted it on my behalf because I was tired and my health was starting to decline, and nothing serious, just the normal wear of 75 years, and I was slowing down and needed more rest, but I was at peace with it. I spent more time in my garden and wrote letters to the families we'd helped, and played with Grace, who was learning to walk and talk, and her first word was Mama, but her second word was Mimi, which is what she called me, and my heart melted every time she said it. One quiet afternoon, I sat on my porch and thought about everything, and about the scared woman who'd been kicked out on Halloween, and about the documents in the safe, and about the phone call to Margaret, and about every brave choice I'd made after that, and I realized something important. I'd spent the first 68 years of my life being small and being quiet and being what other people needed me to be. And then, in one moment of crisis, I'd found my voice and discovered my power, and the last 7 years had been the most alive I'd ever felt. Kylie's release date approached, and she'd reached out through Patricia, asking if I'd be willing to meet, and I thought about it for weeks and discussed it with Justin and Margaret, and finally decided yes, and not because I owed her anything, but because I was curious about who she'd become. We met at a neutral location and a community center conference room with Patricia present, and Kylie walked in, looking older and humbler, and her expensive clothes were gone and replaced with simple jeans and a sweater, and her face had lines that weren't there before. She sat down across from me and said, Mrs. Rodriguez, thank you for agreeing to see me, and I know I don't deserve your time, and I just wanted to look you in the eye and tell you, I'm sorry and not sorry. Like I want something from you, but sorry, because I finally understand what I did and who I hurt and how much I destroyed. I listened as she talked about her years in prison and about the therapy and education and hard work of confronting who she'd been, and she said the worst part wasn't losing my freedom, and it was losing my children and knowing I did that to myself and knowing they're better off without me. She said I saw Leo's scholarship announcement in the paper, and I saw Mia's art exhibition reviewed online, and I see what good people they're becoming, and that's because of you, and because of Justin, and because of Rachel. And I had my chance and I blew it, and I accept that. I asked her what she planned to do after release, and she said, I'm going to work at a nonprofit that helps formerly incarcerated women, and I'm going to use my degree and try to help people, and I know I can never undo the harm I caused, but maybe I can prevent someone else from making my mistakes. I looked at her for a long moment and said, Kylie, I believe in second chances, and I believe people can change, but I also believe that redemption is a lifelong journey and not a destination, and you'll have to prove through your actions over years, and not just words, and whether Leo and Mia ever want contact with you is their choice, and I won't influence them either way, but I hope for your sake that you really have changed. She nodded, and tears rolled down her face, and she said, Thank you for everything, Mrs. Rodriguez, and thank you for saving my children from me, and thank you for being what I should have been, and I know you don't owe me forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it, and I just needed you to know that you won, and not just the legal battle, but the battle for my children's souls and their future, and I'm grateful they have you. We parted ways, and I felt closure I hadn't known I needed, and I'd spent years wondering if I'd done the right thing, and if I'd destroyed a family or saved one. And now I knew with certainty that I'd saved it, and everything had worked out exactly as it should.